die, Father? Is there anything left? Ever since I was a child, I had a feeling that something is missing me. I want to know why I'm here. Can any of us know that? Become yourself. Then God and the devil don't matter. I want to learn. I want to understand. Be careful. Can you find the force to enable these two quite opposite lines to live together in yourself? At any moment, the wolf can devour the lamb. And you must learn what it means to become responsible. This is an exact science. And that is why you are here.
From before known history to the unknown future, this is Red Ice Radio. For the Seeker.
Think and know what. I must strive to know.
Welcome to everyone tuning in from around the world. This is Red Ice Radio. My name is Henrik, and we are happy to be able to continue to bring you some of the most interesting research, thoughts, and opinions on many of the subjects that we find to be the most important and interesting. Our websites, redicecreations.com and redicemembers.com, has more for you. We have RSS feeds for your convenience, newsletter, and of course a busy news section also. Ian R. Crane is an ex-oilfield executive who now lectures, writes, and broadcasts on the geopolitical webs that are being spun, with particular focus on U.S. hegemony and the New World Order agenda for control of global resources. Primarily, Ian focuses his attention and research on the geopolitical arena, but has a deep personal interest in folklore, mythology, and the cosmological beliefs of ancient and indigenous cultures. Today we're going to talk about fracking, or hydraulic fracturing. This is the process of forcing open fissures in the subterranean rocks, specifically the oil and gas-rich shale, to be able to extract it. A mixture of water, chemicals, and sand is injected into the well at high pressure. This fractures the shale and props open fissures that causes the gas to flow out of the well. This is the idea, anyway. There are a lot of problems with this procedure, causing many side effects. Today we're going to detail a few of these. We will also discuss the globalist financial war against mankind, the systematic destruction of various cultures around Europe. Cyprus, Ireland, and Sweden have all been decimated since they joined the European Union. Stay with us and we'll talk more about this. Well, hi, Ian. Good to talk to you again. Hope you're doing well, and well, it's good to have you back on the show.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate being back with you, Henrik.
You bet. Always interesting having you on. It's always we always learn a lot, and there's always a lot of interesting things to get to, and no different today. We're going to focus on fracking, of course, and I wanted to begin to ask you a little bit about the history of fracking, or hydraulic fracturing as it's known. I read up a little bit today on it, and I know that two gentlemen by the name of Floyd Ferris and J.B. Clark from good old John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil are credited with the invention of this thing. But it's been going for some time now, but it's, in my opinion, anyway, just in the last few years, really, that more and more attention have been brought to this, quote unquote, controversial method of extracting oil. But what do you know about the history of fracking?
Well, obviously, you've just highlighted the absolute origins. It was actually picked up by Halliburton, and perhaps what a lot of people don't realize is that the oil companies themselves don't actually do very much in terms of the oilfield services, i.e. They don't provide any of the equipment, the rigs, they don't do the drilling, they don't do the completion of the wells, which is the cementing of the wells, they don't do the perforation or the fracking. That is the domain of the oilfield service companies. And the division in the corporate world is that the oilfield service companies don't produce or sell oil. and the oil companies don't provide their own services. So it's very much a symbiotic relationship. And Halliburton, obviously working for Standard Oil, decided that the fracturing process could be developed. And I believe that the earliest fracks were in the late 1940s, about 1947. And back then, it really was a case of, they were fairly simplistic by today's standards, in that it was ostensibly a water frack. In other words, fresh water was simply pumped down the well at as much pressure as they could possibly muster. And then in pumping the water into the well, obviously it has to go somewhere. It's under enormous pressure. What it does is it finds the point of least resistance, and the point of least resistance is actually within the geology. So what it does is it opens up the geology. And if you're dealing with a tight geology, in other words, it's a geology that's not particularly porous, and therefore the oil or the gas can't actually migrate to the bottom of the well, then the fracking process opens up micro channels and enables the oil or the gas to migrate. And then these micro channels that are opened up with the frack process are then plugged with grains of sand or silica, which sort of keep them open and therefore allow the sort of porosity to be retained. But what's happened over the years is that the fracking process has become more, how should I say, pernicious, in that obviously the oil industry, as it has been endeavoring to milk some of the reservoirs. I mean, you remember a few years ago, Henrik, that the phrase peak oil was on a lot of people's lips?
Oh, sure. It was, we were overdue 5 years by now, I think, at least, right?
Oh, well, exactly. And I mean, long time overdue.
Yep.
Well, of course, peak oil was the hypothesis, and for some people still is the hypothesis, that we have effectively extracted all the easy to get at oil. And, we're in the process of effectively extracting the last dregs, and therefore this is the last days of hydrocarbons. But, the reality is that the people who were putting that hypothesis forward generally had either a vested interest or no knowledge of the oil industry, or certainly the geology from which oil and gas emanates. And when I say they had vested interests, even the term fossil fuel is actually used by those with vested interest, because using the term fossil fuel lays the subliminal that what we're talking about is a finite resource.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I.e., there was only a limited number of dinosaurs or forests or whatever that got compressed into the earth. Therefore, it's a finite resource. But the reality is that any geologist who tells you definitively that they know the origins and can describe the origins of oil and gas definitively, then they are delusional, because they can't. They can't. And if a geologist and a petroleum engineer is intellectually honest, they will admit that all we have is hypotheses as to how oil and gas emanates. Now, in the East, in Russia, for example, for nearly 70 years, they've effectively managed their hydrocarbon resources with a completely different philosophy. And that is that certainly since the end of the Second World War, the Russians have worked on the basis that the oil emanates from deep in the bowels of the earth and then works its way through a series of reservoirs and then eventually percolates up towards the surface. But they've never attempted to, define the actual origin of the fluid. And, various hypotheses have been put forward that, oil is like the lubricant between the tectonic plates, or even the lifeblood of the earth,
mm-hmm.
of Gaia.
Yeah.
So when the Russians have managed their reservoirs, they monitor the reservoir pressure very, very carefully. And they have a formula which they adhere to, so that when the reservoir drops to a particular level, a predetermined level, they effectively cap the reservoir. They shut the well in, and then they continue to monitor it. And what they have learned from their research over 70 years is that if you leave it, over time, the reservoir will actually replenish, and it will return to natural pressure, or the original pressure, and then you can tap into it again. And consequently, the Russians have, how should I say, made much better use of their reservoirs than the Western philosophy, which has been to suck it dry until you reach the point where it's no longer economically viable, and then you just shut it in with the idea that you're never going to go back to it. Wow. Now, over the last few years, without actually openly admitting it, a number of oil companies have actually started the process of monitoring their reservoirs, and they do know that some of these reservoirs do return to pressure. And of course, once again, there are various hypotheses as to how this happens. I mean, some people have claimed that it's simply oil from other reservoirs migrating into this one, again looking for the point of least resistance. So the point here is that we don't actually know, and we are tapping into something. We know how to get at it, and we've certainly made good use of it. And the great tragedy is, of course, that we've never actually needed really to use this kind of volume anyway. I mean, the fact that the world is now consuming 98 million barrels of hydrocarbons each and every day is an absurdity. Yeah. An absolute absurdity. But, just as it was Standard Oil that first came up with the idea of fracturing the geology, it was John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil who instructed Henry Ford to stop building electric cars in 1896. Yeah. There was actually an infrastructure in place in many cities in the US, and I'll use New York as an example because in New York it's a matter of public record that there were 2,500 personal vehicles registered in the city of New York in 1896, and of those 2,500, 1,800 of them were electric.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and it's obviously a little known fact, and it was John D. Rockefeller who instructed Henry Ford to stop building the electric car because obviously he wasn't able to sell oil in the volume that he wanted, or petrol, to those people who were driving electric vehicles. And, Rockefeller realized that if he was going to maximize this natural resource that he had tapped into and was buying up literally lock, stock and proverbial barrel, he needed to ensure that the world, or certainly at the time the US, was reliant on that product for its main means of transportation. So in fact, it was John D. Rockefeller who systematically, through his various companies, bought up the electric tram companies that had been built in many cities around the US in the late 19th century. And he wound down the tram services and then introduced buses, which obviously needed petrol or diesel. And then over time, he wound down the bus services just as the personal vehicle was becoming more affordable. And obviously because people weren't able to rely on buses in the way that they had been previously, then when they had the means, they went out and bought a personal vehicle. And that's how we have the birth, really, of the internal combustion engine. And, when you think about it, Henrik, look at the absurdity. Look at every other thing that we use in terms of our technology, whether it's our computing, our phones, any of the sort of domestic products that we use. Yet, for our main means of transportation, we are still using a technology that is primarily 140 years old.
Yeah. Not much have changed. Okay, a little bit of the efficiency here and there, and certainly the outer shell has changed, but that's about it. The packaging, the wrapping,
Well, and not even the efficiency. This is a myth. This is a myth. The average mileage that a personal vehicle returns is 35 miles a gallon. Now, this is very carefully calculated. Don't think that this is that there is a science to this. I mean, obviously there are cars that return more than 35 miles a gallon, but there's a hell of a lot on the road, and mine included, because I drive a 20-year-old Mitsubishi diesel. But my vehicle gets me about 25 miles a gallon. But there are vehicles on the road that, will get 60, 70. But the average across all consumers is 35 miles a gallon. And this is the calculation that the oil industry, with national governments, have effectively come up with, because that is what enables them to sell their 98 million barrels of hydrocarbons every day. And for Western governments in particular, it's the means by which they extract revenue from the general public. After income tax, taxation on hydrocarbons is the most effective way of gaining taxation revenue.
That's right. We have 60% in Sweden on oil and gas and everything else. They make a lot of money on that.
Exactly. It's pretty much the same here in the UK. In fact, we're paying about just under £1.40 for a litre. And of that, 86 pence is tax.
Yeah.
So, and we're in a situation supposedly where Western economies are in a world of hurt because of the debt that they've created. And yet, here we are today, and we're paying more in tax on every litre of fuel that's purchased than we were actually paying for a litre of fuel just 8 years ago.
Yeah, but it's for the environment. Just paying money to the government that aids the environment in so many ways. Well,
these are of course the mythologies that they create to plant in people's minds so that they will part with their hard-earned cash so easily. And of course the other irony is that people very conveniently and very quickly forget that just 14 years ago, oil was $9.81 a barrel. And of course it was ramped up to $147 a barrel in July of 2008, and now we're back just under $100. But in the UK media, it's presented that oil is now more expensive than it's ever been before, and that's why we're having to pay the high prices at the pumps. Yet in reality, oil isn't at the highest price it's ever been. I mean, it is literally just over 60% of what it was in 2008, July 2008, yet we're paying more at the pump. And that is attributable to two things: profiteering by the oil and gas companies and the high level of taxation.
Yeah.
So, however we look at it, obviously it's the corporations that are literally fleecing the people, and obviously the banks are fleecing the people via the governments and their revenue collection techniques, which are immediately being used to be returned to the banks for the interest on the debt that's been created.
Yeah. Well, this is what happens as well. When Standard Oil is one of the first, I think, trust monopolies out there as well. They're in the business of forming cartels. Eventually they merge into the government, and they're there to, eradicate competition, and they want to basically shut down the ability for people to have other options, and they become the only option, the only available, thing out there, basically.
Well, you've hit it absolutely on the head there, Henrik. One of the observations that I use in my financial terrorism talks is that what's going on here is it is a game of Monopoly. And you've played Monopoly, Henrik, yes?
Oh, sure.
Okay. So we'll assume that everybody who's listening has played Monopoly. And, of course, Monopoly starts in an interesting way, and that is that everybody is given the same pot of money. But one of the players actually has a little bit of an advantage because that player plays the role of the banker. And if you actually ask anybody, and I've done this in my talks, you ask the audience, has anybody ever actually finished a game of Monopoly? And of course, very few people have actually finished a game. They normally get to the point where they're bored after about 2 or 3 days, and they just agree to add up who's got the most money and declare that person the winner. But of course, that's not the purpose of the game. The purpose of the game is the last man standing. It is literally about total ownership of the board. And of course, the banker has a bit of an advantage because, God forbid that I might suggest that any of our listeners here might have used their position as banker to, how should I say, enhance their cash flow maybe when they were, just like in the real world. So 9 times out of 10, if somebody has won a game of Monopoly, they've won it when they were the banker. And what we've got going on in the real world, dare I say, right now, in the three-dimensional construct, is the bankers are in the final round of the game of Monopoly, and they are literally going for total ownership. I mean, they've basically got it with Greece. They've pretty much got it with Portugal. They've got it with Ireland, and we'll talk more about Ireland in a little while. And now they're going basically for the rest of the world. And, as you rightly say, it is their goal is the total monopoly, total ownership of everything on the planet. The only reason they want to encourage entrepreneurs and inventors, individual inventors, is so that they can get their hands on those designs, on those patents, and prevent anything coming to market which might actually offer competition to their monopoly.
Yeah.
So hydrocarbons industry, we actually have a global hydrocarbon-based economy. And of course, this was stimulated back in the 1970s when James A. Baker III and Henry Kissinger instructed Richard Nixon to remove the US dollar from the gold standard on August the 15th, 1971. Now, up until that time, I mean, basically gold from 1830, when gold was just over $18 an ounce, to 1929, when it was just over $19 an ounce, with the manipulated financial crash of 29 to 33, gold basically doubled in price, and by 1935, it was $35 an ounce. And it held at $35 an ounce right up to August the 15th, 1971. And in theory, any American citizen could walk into a bank with $35 and ask for an ounce of gold in return. And this is how effectively global currencies, particularly the US dollar, was held in check. But after 71, 2 years later, we had the second Middle East crisis with the Arab-Israel war. And Kissinger and Baker took advantage of this, and they approached OPEC, and they put a proposition to OPEC. They said, we would like you guys to increase the price of oil by 4-fold. The downside is that we're going to blame you for that increase, and the Western media is going to have a field day blaming the nasty Arab OPEC committee for increasing the price of oil. But in return, you get 4 times what you're getting right now. In addition, we want you to accept the floating US dollar. In other words, the US dollar is not actually backed by anything. But you can use those US dollars and you can spend them in our economy. So the initial conversation between Baker and Kissinger was with the secretary of OPEC at the time, which was the Saudi oil minister, Sheikh Yamani. And in the aftermath, when it was announced that OPEC were increasing the price of oil by 4-fold, the British media almost all ran the same headline, which said, Yamani or your life. Anyway, obviously they did increase the price, and they did take payment in petrodollars. And of course, these petrodollars were used to purchase equipment from the US, and primarily arms. I mean, a lot of other stuff as well, but a big chunk of what they were purchasing with this easy money that they were getting was armaments. And so, the globalists were really taking this opportunity to make sure that everybody was fully tooled up, so that when they actually started the strife in these regions, then everybody had the appropriate toys to play with.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see how the game starts to play out here. So, meanwhile, of course, gold and oil still have a relationship. I mean, I've heard the likes of Richard Heinberg. I actually attended a presentation by Richard Heinberg where he stated categorically that there was no relationship between the price of oil and the price of gold. And with all due respect, I mean, this is just pure ignorance, because the price of oil has basically stayed at approximately 7.66% of an ounce of gold for the past 70 years. I mean, a little bit of fluctuation either side, but give or take, it's really held at 7.66%. And there's a very simple reason for this, and that is that once the OPEC countries had bought all the toys that they needed, the military toys they needed from the US, they still had buku US dollars, petrodollars hanging around that they needed to do something with. And they knew, I mean, their own economists were smart enough to know that these petrodollars were going to reduce in value. And so what they were doing, any spare that they had, they were buying up gold. And the fact that the price of gold has gone from $35 on August the 15th, 1971, to the 1600 and whatever it is today, 1605, something in that region. So, the reality is that a dollar today is literally worth 2.2 cents from 1971. And so consequently, gold holds the purchasing power, and the fiat currencies backed by nothing, basically they float, and obviously depending on how much is floating around will depend on how much people can pay for something. Because it's like me buying something from you. If I know that you want to buy something from me, and I know that all you've got is $20, I know that as soon as I ask for $21, you can't buy it, because that's more than you've got. Yeah. But if I know that you've got $20,000, I might not be greedy and ask you for all the 20,000, but I can certainly ask you for a lot more than 20. And so consequently, this is how inflation is manipulated. And the reality is that obviously the vast majority of people have had money stolen from them over the past, certainly, what would it be, 43 years now, through inflation. And what we've seen literally in the last couple of weeks is another version of that, of course, in Cyprus.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because Cyprus is part of the euro, and therefore you can't just fleece money from the people of Cyprus by pumping more money into the economy and thereby creating inflation. Because it's part of the Eurozone, if you did it in Cyprus, it would actually percolate through all the other countries in the Eurozone. So that's why they decided that the only way in which they could do this and simply only penalise Cyprus was through the raid on savings accounts within the Cypriot banks. And of course, I mean, we're going to see that, I think, more and more. And, as I've said many times over the last few years, the only thing that you should have in the bank is an overdraft.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, ultimately, when I see this, what's happening in Cyprus, I'm just like, get your money out of these banks, and get them into a credit union or something. And even if they don't have an equivalent of that in Cyprus, get together and organize it, set it up, get out of there,
And if you can't do that, buy gold and silver.
Sure. Yep.
The only surefire way of protecting the purchasing power of your accumulated wealth is with gold and silver. Anything else is potentially at risk. And I think, we're probably going to see a lot more of that because, when I've been talking about the possibility of the banks literally shutting their doors, and in the US in particular, every bank, I think it was in 2009, every bank sent out a letter to its account holders stating that they reserved the right to close the bank's doors without notice. Well, and that, of course, happened in Italy a couple of years ago, where one of the banks, I think, it might have been last year, but one of the banks actually shut its doors at the end of May and said that it wasn't opening again until the beginning of July. So all of the people who had accounts literally had to write IOUs for a month until they could access their accounts again.
Yeah.
So, we've seen a few of these experiments occurring, and whereas the people in Cyprus just a month ago would never have believed that their banks would steal sort of 10% of their savings, people in the likes of the UK and the US, would think it's complete anathema, but they should now realize that it's a very real possibility.
Oh, indeed. I mean, Cyprus was the richest of the 10 countries that joined the EU in 2004. And it was, considered to be kind of like a, quote unquote tax haven. We know that there's a lot of, Russian investors who had accounts in Cyprus and everything like that. It seems to be something going on behind the scenes, potentially a ongoing kind of, Cold War, if you will, and Cyprus being almost some kind of, I don't know, satellite state, considering how much, Russia had invested in Cyprus. I'm not sure. But one thing I did find very interesting is that in 2007, there was actually, it has a Greek name, and I'm going to slaughter this completely here, but Anastasios Orphanides, who worked, he previously worked for the U.S. Federal Reserve before he became, governor of the Bank of Cyprus in 2007. Could that have anything to do with this? Don't know.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I mean, I think I articulated this on a previous show with you. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the introduction of the euro was part of the strategy with which to literally bring these Eurozone countries to their knees.
That's right. Yep.
And of course, the strategy was very clear for anybody who knew a little bit of history, because what happened between 2002 and 2007 was exactly the same as what happened in the US between 1925 and 1929. When the Federal Reserve literally flooded the markets with money. So everybody was supposedly enjoying this phenomenal boom. And then when the Federal Reserve pulled in the reins, they brought about the contrived collapse. And we could see exactly the same going on between 2002 and 2007, which is why, I mean, there were many people who saw it coming. I don't claim any special insight. I mean, I just read the scripts along with many, many others. But, and I, bought a whole bunch of books on the imminent house price collapse for the sole reason that I wanted to demonstrate to my partner at the time that I was not the only one who was, of the view that we needed to get out of the property market as soon as possible. This was in 2006, because within a year or two, the market was going to tank beyond anything that anybody could possibly imagine. And we actually ended up selling our property literally on the cusp. We sold it on the weekend, the middle weekend of October 2007. And that was the point at which the UK market sort of really went into phenomenal decline. So, I mean, it was clear that all of this easy credit, obviously debt, this debt that was mounting up, both on a national level, a corporate level, and on a personal level, was going to end in tears. It's
so funny how it always follows the same procedure. I've brought this up a couple of times now, but back in the early 90s, Sweden had pretty much a blueprint of what happened globally in 2007 and 8. We had the bailouts and everything. We had the, the country printing more and more money, and the few safety measures that were in place previously were basically, they were regulated out of existence by government and the central bank altogether, so that when there was so much money flooding in, the safety measure to stop this or to counteract it in some way was, prevented from being there anymore. And this resulted in a big crash and a bailout, and, all the money's removed from all the people. And then, there was after this point that we entered in the union. So it's kind of a flip from what happened to Cyprus. They're entering into it, and then they kind of destroyed it, if you will. But nonetheless, it's a blueprint, and people are playing into it. They're like, "Oh, boom time, excellent! Let's let's buy easy money," kind of thing, and they just don't realize what's going on.
Yeah, they're being led like lambs to the proverbial slaughter.
That's right. Yeah,
and the players, the manipulators, I mean, the ones in the public eye, they take their multiple roles. And I mean, if we actually look at the relationship between the hydrocarbons industry and what's occurred here, there's no more prominent individual than Peter Sutherland. And now Peter Sutherland is an Irishman by accident of birth. But I mean, Peter Sutherland's background is that he was a former Attorney General of the Irish government. And of course, the role of the Attorney General is to ensure that the government of the day actually upholds the constitution of the country. But Peter Sutherland is an arch globalist. And in my opinion, I mean, he is the guy that has literally manipulated events that have brought about the absolute demise of the Irish nation as a sovereign state. And if we look at where Peter Sutherland went from his days as Attorney General in Ireland, he went on to become an EU commissioner. He then went on to become the founding Director General of the World Trade Organization in 1994. He became chairman of Allied Irish Bank. He became a member of the Trilateral Commission. He went on to become chairman of BP. He went on to become chairman of Goldman Sachs. And he was a member of the board of the Royal Bank of Scotland when it collapsed in 2008. And at that time, he was asked to leave by the British government and was offered a ridiculously healthy sum of money to leave quietly. I mean, this is a guy who's absolutely at the heart of globalism. And he was a member of the Bilderberger meeting in 2009. And one of the charts that I use in my presentations is I use a chart which shows all of the members, all of the known participants of that 2009 Bilderberger meeting, and I show the links between those individuals and the corporations and NGOs, non-government organizations, and charities, and government departments, and it's an incredible tangled web. And of course, the reality is that nobody gets into a senior level of government, nobody gets into a senior level in the corporate world or into the military unless they are regarded as a safe pair of hands.
Sure.
Who can be relied upon to, do the bidding of the, if you like, the inner sanctum at the heart of this global corporatist agenda. And Sutherland's role in literally destroying Ireland was, although I can't prove he was physically present at the meeting in September 2008, the meeting has the spectre of Peter Sutherland all over it. But the meeting was attended by, we know, Dermot Gleeson, who at the time was the chairman of Allied Irish Bank, by Paul Gallagher, who was the sitting Attorney General of the Irish government at that time, and the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister of Ireland, and his Chancellor at that time. That's Brian Cowan and Brian Lenihan. Now, the guy who was chairman of Allied Irish Bank and the guy who was the sitting Attorney General of the Irish government at that time, Paul Gallagher, both of those were Bilderbergers. And it is my supposition that Sutherland instructed Gleeson and Gallagher to instruct Cowan and Lenihan to underwrite all of the liabilities and the assets of the Irish banks by the Irish taxpayer. And, for 6 months, that seemed like a good idea. But of course, really, to anybody who knew what was going on, it was literally the death knell for the Irish economy. And, Ireland today is nothing more than a colony of the EU.
Yeah.
Brian Lenihan made a very pertinent statement in early 2009. He said, because of Ireland's dire financial situation, we need 200,000 people to leave the country. And he was really aiming that at the young people. Well, actually, in the last 5 years, it's estimated that something in the region of about 500,000 young people have left Ireland. And this is the core of really what I was presenting when I did a tour in Ireland 2 years ago. And the title of that tour was The Pillage of Ireland's Resources. And I was making the observation that the goal was to depopulate Ireland so that the globalists could come into Ireland and literally pillage the phenomenal natural resources that sit either underneath Irish soil or within Irish territorial waters. And tragically, this is exactly, what is occurring. And this all brings us back to the fracking agenda, because what has happened is over the last 30 years or so, fracking has, I won't say been perfected because it's a long way from being perfect. But what has happened is that fracking has gone from being primarily hydraulic fracturing. I mean, that was a pretty reasonable term to use because initially it was hydraulic, i.e. the reference to water. Mm-hmm. But today, the hydraulic can really only sort of refer to a liquid, because to maximize the impact of the frack job, the engineers, the design engineers, are now incorporating incredible toxic cocktails, which make up as much as 10% of the total frack fluid. And the issue has become that these cocktails have been added because once they realized that they could open the rocks with water, and then somebody said, well, you know what, if we add this and this and this, we can actually get another 10% yield or 20% yield or 30% yield. And so what's happened is over the last sort of couple of decades, the development of the frack fluid has become literally an occult technology. And I don't use that term lightly, but I use it in the sense that the companies that are doing the frack jobs will not share the detail of the recipe of what it is that they're pumping into the ground. You know, the only thing that they're interested in, and the only thing their clients are interested in, is maximizing the job, the frack job, to open the porosity and increase the flow of oil or gas into the well, regardless of any potential consequences. Now, the only thing they've been trying to do, obviously, is maintain the integrity of the actual well itself. But what has now manifested in places like Colorado in particular, where they've been fracking the gas from the Colorado shale deposits for close on 20 years. And the problem is when you pump this stuff into the ground, you really have no idea where it's going. You know where it's starting from. It's starting from the bottom of the well. But then once it's going through the perforations in the casing, the only thing you know is that it is opening up the immediate geology. The problem is that some of the frack jobs are so successful because the pressure and the combination of the pressure and the toxic mix opens up the geology to the extent that it breaches into other strata. And of course, the next strata of geology may be openly porous. So in other words, the frack fluid may simply migrate through that porous geology, and it'll just continue migrating until eventually it migrates into underground water supplies. And what we've seen now in Colorado, we see the physical evidence of the impact on the soil, because the water has contaminated the soil. And obviously once the water's contaminated the soil, you can't grow crops in the soil. You can't keep livestock on the pasture. You can't drink the water. And as people are now beginning to realize, you can't bathe in it, because as you bathe in this water that's been contaminated either by methane or methane and the frack fluids, these chemicals are percolating into the physical body through the organ of the skin, and then it's manifesting as horrendous health issues, 5, 10, 15 years down the line. And this is the part of the story that isn't being put forward to the people in this dash for gas right now.
Yeah.
And the reason they're going for shale gas is because it is the new low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, let me just back up a little bit, because I was curious about Ireland. You said the resources that are there. Are we primarily talking about oil for fracking then? Have they done surveys on this so they know what they're going to eventually go after?
Listen, Ireland's territorial waters actually account for 23% of all of the EU's territorial waters.
That much?
Yes. 23%. Because of where Ireland sits. Remember, Norway's not part of the EU.
That's right.
Right? So once you take Norway out of the equation and you look at the coastline of the EU countries, Ireland, bear in mind that its territorial waters extend 200 miles beyond its land borders. Ireland accounts for 23% of the waters. Now, I'll just give you another example of how Ireland's been fleeced of its natural resources. So with 23% of the EU waters, you would think that Ireland would be in great shape in terms of providing fish resources to the EU. You'd think.
Yeah.
But the Irish fishing waters was sold to the EU for a one-off payment of 6 billion euros. So Ireland today actually can only fish just over 15% of its waters. The remainder is open to the EU fishing fleet. So this is another example of how the national economy is effectively destroyed. I mean, one of the visionaries who saw what was happening to Ireland was a guy called Raymond Crotty. And this is a guy who in the late 60s, early 70s was farming in Kilkenny. And he could see that the common agricultural policy of the EU was designed to destroy Irish farming.
Yeah.
And he realized that no one was going to listen to a Kilkenny farmer. So he went to university and he studied agricultural economics. So now here was a practicing farmer with a qualification in agricultural economics, and he started to talk about the common agricultural policy and how it was going to literally destroy Irish farming. With all the various subsidies that were on offer, farmers were becoming incredibly lazy. Crops weren't being properly rotated, and he could see that within a couple of generations, Ireland was going to become a net importer of food, rather, as opposed to a net exporter as it was in the 70s. So he was totally vilified in Ireland. And in fact, he spent much of his career actually working with people in the Far East and in Latin America. But Crotty also should be remembered for something else, and that is that the reason the Irish people have actually had referenda on whether or not they remain in the EU is actually thanks to Raymond Crotty. Because in addition to seeing what the common agricultural policy was doing to Irish farming, he could also see that the game plan of what was then the European Common Market was literally to subjugate sovereign nations. And so in 1986, he took the Irish government to court in Ireland, and basically his proposition was that it would be illegal for any Irish government to hand power over to a foreign entity without getting the permission of the people, i.e. through a referendum. And he could really see history repeating itself here, because in 1800, the Irish government signed the Act of the Union. And in 1800, that came about because the Irish government of the day was so indebted to the UK, to Britain and the British bankers, that they could see no way forward other than to effectively dissolve the Irish government, dissolve the nation state, and effectively integrate the country into the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland.
And then later the EU. I go back to what Peter Sutherland said earlier. He said that the European Union, in my view, should be doing its best to undermine any sense of our homogeneity and difference from others, meaning that he has obviously no veneration for culture, countries, or people. And, it's also funny at the same time then that how his vision on how immigrations are going to solve this job crisis that he talks about in some of his interviews actually clashes with the fact that you just mentioned how the youth are now fleeing the country because there's nothing there for them anymore. It's ruined. I mean, what is going on here?
Well, it is this continued agenda. I mean, it's the same as we saw. It's a repeat. It's history repeating itself again. And just to sort of show how this is the repetition, because after the Act of Union was signed in 1800, the British landowners moved in and bought up Irish land for pennies on the pound. And 40 years later, there was a manipulated famine, potato famine. I mean, there was no famine in Ireland. I mean, when we understand what actually happened, it becomes quite easy to comprehend why it is that so many Irish people still have great animosity towards the Brits. Because the British landowners were shipping all of the agricultural produce, the beef, the lamb, the dairy produce, the crops. They were shipping them out of Ireland because they could get more money for those crops in the British Empire, leaving the Irish peasants who were working the land to survive on nothing but the potatoes that they were growing. And there was indeed a potato blight, but there was no famine. And the British landowners used this as an opportunity to depopulate the indigenous people. So many of them died, of course, but those who realized that if they didn't get out, they were going to die, then they took the option of a ticket to cross the Atlantic, which is why when you go to St. John's in Newfoundland, it's more Irish than an Irish town.
Yeah, that's right. It's the same with Sweden. I mean, there's more people who fled from Sweden, back in those days that live in America now than they do in Sweden. Now, this is there's a great website called irishholocaust.org,
yeah.
irishholocaust.org. Go there and read some of that stuff and check that out. And I mean, I've seen the same patterns in Sweden in different times, and it's happened in Norway and other cultures around, various native cultures around Europe has been subjected to this systematic destruction, and there's different waves of them happening all the time. It's an ongoing war. That's what people don't understand,
Absolutely. And as you rightly say, I mean, this EU policy of open borders, of course, to destroy the national culture and also to destroy the economy. And I mean, in Ireland, obviously, the young people have left because there was just nothing for them. There was no work.
Yep.
But even the work that was there was minimum wage, because employers were realizing that basically there was such an influx of people from Eastern Europe that these people from Eastern Europe would take any job at minimum wage because it was 2 or 3 times more than they were getting back home.
Yep.
So even though it was barely enough to live on in Ireland, they thought it was
great.
A king's
Perfect.
ransom.
Yeah.
And they were sort of course, they were making it work for them because they were renting houses and they were hotbedding in houses. So you'd have multiple families living in a house or multiple single people working different shifts. And the indigenous population is just forced out.
That's right.
And we have the same situation in England today, where we have more people earning minimum wage than at any time since records began.
That's right. And that's why people should be really careful about immigration and what this is doing to the country. And it's nothing to do about, being racist or anti other cultures and like that. It's about thinking about your countrymen, your children, those in your own country, and understanding, okay, is this going to be better for all of us or is it not? Is it going to lower all the standards consequently, or is it going to increase it? And I mean, I believe, again, these people who are coming in are obviously also used because, I mean, life for them is not really that much better. Sure, they might have as you said, comparatively might be a little bit better, but it's basically just about relocating the problem. And it's not about going to the core of the problem and solving it there. It's just destabilizing more and more regions and more countries. And it's as I said, it's an ongoing systematic destruction of the cultures around Europe.
Absolutely. And what it does, of course, is it breaks up the fabric of society so that, when you have an issue that should be being addressed literally right across the country, it's fragmented because, the people from the immigrant communities aren't interested in the same way as people would be if it was their home country.
Naturally, yeah, of course.
For sure. I mean, I was the same when I was an expat working in the oil industry. Local issues didn't really bother me at all. I didn't get involved.
Yeah.
They didn't impact on me. I was there for the duration, and then I was going to be moving on, so I didn't get involved. So, when people came knocking on my door trying to solicit my views or my signature on a particular document, I wasn't interested. Well, that's the difference for the expat community. But now, obviously, we've got these massive influxes of people from cultures all over the world. They are migrating into areas where they obviously create micro cultures or micro communities and within the country, and they're completely abstract. They're outside of what is going on in that country. So here we have a situation in the UK, for example, where we have something which is being floated, which should automatically be a no-brainer, and everyone basically uniting behind a clarion call to not go down this particular route. And it's extremely difficult because a significant chunk of the population just doesn't give a damn.
Yeah. It's about breaking up the community, dividing people, as you say. And although the opposite is being suggested, again, going back to that interview I read with Peter Sutherland, about his referencing that basically, well, we have to break up all these countries and we have to just shatter what's there now and create this kind of one homogeneous big pot of everything, and because it will be more easily for them to control, it will be more broken up, and hence they can really get in there. They can rule, if you will, from a central position in Europe, and no one will know what the hell is going on anymore.
Exactly, and they can literally just ride roughshod over everybody within the EU. And I mean, they're behind schedule. Their original goal was to have the North American Union in place by now. And obviously they're way behind schedule there because
I think they have to take away the guns in the United States first. That's why they shifted the agenda. They've realized somewhere along the road here that, wait a minute, all these people have guns here. We got to do something about this. We got to go work on that, and then we could bring in another kind of dictatorial style government over there. That's what I think anyway.
Well, exactly. I think you're right, and that's why they created the Hollywood event known as Sandy Hook.
That's
but
right.
We won't go down there right now. But yeah, so they're behind the schedule in establishing the North American Union. And of course, the original game plan was that by 2015, they would merge the North American Union with the European Union into the North Atlantic Union. And they're now looking at that as a possibility maybe in 2022 to 2025. But there's a hell of a lot of water that can go under the bridge between now and then, because more and more people are actually waking up to what's occurring here, because they're beginning to realize that they're being fleeced of everything that they have worked hard to accumulate. They're being denied the opportunity to actually earn even a basic living. There's no opportunity for the young generation. I mean, obviously, it's a lot worse and it's been going on a lot longer in Southern Europe than it has in Northern Europe. But, we've now got a situation...
This time around, sorry to interrupt that, but this time around, definitely. As I said before, I think that this has been going on in waves in different times. And we had a really rough patch back in the 90s, as I said before, and had the whole scenario with bailouts and everything. And we've gone through that. And now this time we happen to be spared, if you will, a little bit anyway. I mean, it's not, ideal, obviously, far from it, but it's not as bad as it is in Southern Europe. So this is how they're playing the game. They're moving around the cloud of chaos around the European continent a little bit,
Well, and I mean, because this is literally a totally interconnected agenda, and, we can't talk about the things we're talking about without mentioning the fact that, of course, the attacks are coming through the food, through the water, particularly in Ireland, with a massive fluoride. I mean, no nation has ever been fluoridated in the way that the Irish people have been fluoridated for the last 40 years.
Yeah.
And the good news is they're actually starting to get the topic on the on the agenda at a parliamentary level. I think they've got a long way to go before they get the fluoride out of the water, because, of course, everywhere else in Europe, the push is to get the fluoride into the water.
Yeah.
And as we all know, it has nothing to do with keeping people's teeth healthy.
That's right. Yeah, we did the whole program with Paul Connett from the Fluoride Action Network recently.
Exactly.
Great stuff.
So then we've got the GM foods, we've got the aspartame.
Yeah.
And we've got the vaccines. So we've got this pernicious, multi-pronged attack on humanity. Meanwhile, these guys, the global corporatists working on behalf of those who think they're the rightful rulers, are literally determined to milk the resources. And if in the process of milking the natural resources, they can inadvertently create a situation which makes a significant chunk of the planet uninhabitable, that to them is acceptable collateral.
Well, that's a very interesting point. That's something I wanted to get to because I wanted to talk in the next segment again about the link between, both from Standard Oil that we talked about earlier, that actually is behind the fracking method and everything like that. How they eventually kind of merged into BP through Amoco, I believe, and there's a very interesting story there, and we wanted to tie in more on the Deepwater Horizon, what's going on there right now. But as I think we should take a little break. We should let your voice rest a little bit, Ian, since you're heading out on a tour soon here, and I wanted to talk about that too. So please, give us some details of where you're going, when you're heading out, and websites where people can go to get tickets and get involved in all that.
Okay, well, the tour will kick off on April the 2nd. And it's 60 plus dates around the UK and Ireland. It's called Fractured Future. And the details of the tour are on my website, which is ianrcrane.com.
Very good. ianrcrane.com, and all the details about the talks and all that will be up there. And if you're around in the UK or want to come from other parts of the world, head out there and get involved and see Ian live, because it's great. I've done it several times. So do that. We'll take a short break here and stay with us, and we'll be back with more shortly. We are continuing to bring you more fascinating research and perspectives. Next on Red Ice Radio, we have Kevin Barrett, Graham Hancock, Dean Clifford, Chris Thomas, and many more coming on the program. We will proceed with the second hour over at redicemembers.com, where we have all of our previous programs archived for your convenience. Our program is free from commercial interruptions and blinking website banners in an effort to put the subject at hand at the center. With a membership, you get instant access to all of our archives with radio, TV episodes, webcasts, videos, films, commentary, and music. Take a look around. Try it out for a 3-month subscription. There's a lot to learn, and it does help to broaden one's horizons. It's not about automatically believing in everything that is being said. In our second hour with Ian, we will continue to talk about the systematic destruction of the ecosystem and how, despite the green wave and environmentalism, projects like Agenda 21 is about moving people away from the rural areas into the cities. Fracking is something that aids this more than anything else, making large areas uninhabitable and are forcing people off their land where they can live as they please. We also discuss the Georgia Guidestones, the underlying agenda, the game of monopoly, corporate fascism, and crony capitalism. Government claims to keep us safe with their rules, laws, and regulation, but fail on every level since they are the ones who are sanctioning all of this to proceed. Later, we tie in the BP Deepwater Horizon scandal that occurred in the Gulf in 2010. Don't miss this riveting second hour with Ian Crane as we proceed. Thank you so much for listening.